Hello, I'm Dr. Nathan Smith, and I'm an associate curator in the Dinosaur Institute here at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County. I'm very excited to be speaking to you today at DinoFest, and I'd like to thank everybody at the Natural History Museum of Utah for inviting me to come out, albeit virtually. And currently, our museum and our lab spaces are closed, so I'll be coming to you from my office here to present my seminar today. And I want to kind of expand the scope a little bit and talk more about just the dinosaurs from Antarctica, but give kind of a quick whirlwind tour of the three early Mesozoic faunas that we know about from the central Transantarctic mountains. But first, I want to start off with a little bit of a discussion of why we go to Antarctica to do paleontology, what kind of questions are we interested in, what do we hope to find. And a lot of these circulate around these concepts of biogeography and biodiversity. So if we look at modern vertebrate biodiversity, shown with this heat map here, we see that it's distributed really unevenly across the globe, right? We have hotspots of biodiversity. We have a latitudinal gradient of biodiversity where we have more species at lower latitudes, and then we kind of taper off as we go to higher latitudes in both the south and the north. Well, a big question that paleontologists have is, has this pattern always been consistent through time? What other patterns of biodiversity and biogeography have existed through time, maybe when the continents didn't look like they do today? So these are some of the questions that we have when we go into this Antarctic research. Additionally, this is a graph that's probably familiar to a lot of paleontologists, right? If we're looking at biodiversity in a temporal context, tracing kind of the amount of genera or species through time, this is one of these classic curves, and if we look here, we see 5 major mass extinction events, right, that mark big drop-offs in biodiversity through the past 550 million years or so. One of the challenges we have as paleontologists, though, is that a lot of these patterns are extrapolated from several really well-sampled regions, and if we want to get an understanding of what's actually happening globally, we have to sample globally, not just, common and easy to get to areas. That means going to polar regions like Antarctica to understand what's happening there. Unfortunately, there's a rock record in the central Transantarctic mountains that covers 2 of these major mass extinctions events, right? We have rocks in the Transantarctic mountains spanning from the Permian up to even the middle Jurassic. And there is the Permo-Triassic mass extinction, of course, and then also the End-Triassic mass extinction that exists within this time. So this area of Antarctica offers us a little bit of a window into what's happening at high latitudes during the early Mesozoic. And this is kind of an inset showing you where we're going. So the Transantarctic's cut across the continent of Antarctica. They're actually exposed rock, right? So it's not just kind of ice that we're working with. We're going to the rock just like any other paleontologist would. And to the regions that I'm going to talk about today are the Shackleton Glacier area and then also the Beardmore Glacier from right in the central of that mountain chain. Now, these areas have been worked for a long time by paleontologists. The first vertebrate fossils came out in the late 1960s, and it didn't take long before we kind of discovered a really diverse early Triassic tetrapod fauna through a lot of the work of James Kitching and Ned Colbert. And one of the first things that was really realized was that the animals that were being found in early Triassic sediments in Antarctica bore a lot of similarity to other faunas from Gondwana, notably the South African Karoo Basin. Right? So the first kind of finds coming out in the 60s and 70s pointed to Antarctica having this kind of distinctly Gondwanan and very characteristic early Triassic Lystrosaurus assemblage. Now, at the time, some of these finds were kind of cool because they really represented the last nail in the coffin for any doubters of plate tectonics, right? If you kind of map out where we find Lystrosaurus fossils today, that distribution doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you don't consider the fact that the continents looked very differently 250 million years ago. And like I alluded to, there were other fossils that were coming out beyond just Lystrosaurus that pointed to these biogeographic connections to places like South Africa. That includes the mammal-like reptile Thriaxodon, some really amazing specimens found from the Shackleton Glacier expeditions in the 70s. And that particular region, the Cumulus Hills and surrounding area in the Shackleton Glacier, proved to be really rich for vertebrate fossils. A lot of other kind of similarities to the South African Karoo animals like Prolacerta, animals like Procolophon, right, and multiple localities kind of throughout this region. So this was an area that we were really excited to work in 2017 and 18 on our most recent expedition to the central transantarctic mountains. And this is kind of showing you a little overview of some of that motley crew that participated in that expedition. And again, what we're trying to understand here is the evolution, biogeography, and kind of paleoenvironmental context of some of these animals. Here's an overview of what that camp looks like. So we are camping on the ice, but we're going to go up to the exposed rock. This Shackleton Glacier camp supported about 7 different science teams during that austral summer. We had really great weather, except for a couple foggy days, particularly right around the holidays. And this is an overview. This is one of the sites at Kitchen Ridge, so it gives you an idea of what some of these fossil localities look like, where we're quarrying out some vertebrate fossils. Really great stuff coming from here. This is a great little tiny amphibian skull, and since I'm in the office, I can grab a few things to showcase. My guess is this is not going to show up on the desktop screen as well as it will in the PowerPoint image, but really, really cool stuff. Here's my colleague Roger Smith, this amazing, nearly complete specimen of Procolophon that he pulled out from this site. So lots of great finds to get excited about. This happened near the beginning of our season. Another example of some of the usual characters that came from here. This is a new specimen of Thrinaxodon. You're looking at kind of the backbone running through to the hind limb and tail there. This is when it was found in situ. And here it is partially prepared. You're kind of looking down on the animal in the lab right here in LA. Really, really gorgeous. Again, we're expecting this to be one of the most completely preserved and three-dimensionally preserved specimens of Thrinaxodon that we have yet from Antarctica, so hopefully a lot more insight into the paleobiology of that animal. This is a quick little video showing you, how we do some of the quarrying at places in the Shackleton Glacier region. So this is me with one of our circular saws, just quarrying out a block that happened to be another example of Lystrosaurus here. This is at Collinson Ridge, actually, which is nearby our camp. And in addition to revisiting some of these classic localities, we actually discovered new vertebrate localities in the Shackleton Glacier area and took new stratigraphic sections as well, including the identification of a new Permo-Triassic boundary, which is very exciting. Shown here is Julia McIntosh, who actually took that section and made that discovery. Further up the section in a number of places, we also found more vertebrate fossils that kind of extended into the middle member of the Freemouth Formation, which is important for some of our research in terms of stitching together kind of patterns of change in the assemblage through time in this region. But if we want to give kind of a quick overview, okay, what's going on in the early Triassic of Antarctica, what we're seeing is kind of a mass extinction recovery fauna from around 250 million years ago, right after that end Permian or that Permo-Triassic mass extinction. You've got the usual characters like Lystrosaurus and Thrinaxodon, Prolacerta, Procolophon, but also some potential oddballs, right? So some of our new research and reanalysis of previous finds is starting to suggest that, hey, maybe a lot of what's happening in Antarctica, these fossils aren't simply a subset of what we find in places like the Karoo Basin, right? So there are some things that might be unique to Antarctica. There are some taxa that maybe don't necessarily match up perfectly temporally with other parts of Gondwana. We're also finding some really cool paleobiological insights into these animals. So Meg Whitney and Chris Sedor published this great study that just came out last year looking at tusk histology of Lystrosaurus, basically comparing Antarctic samples to the same species, the same taxa in South Africa that are basically living outside of that polar light regime. And what they found is that there is some growth seasonality preserved in these tusk sections that suggests that the Antarctic taxa might have been experiencing, the Antarctic specimens might have been experiencing some seasonal torpor during those long periods of polar darkness in the polar winter. So really, really cool stuff that is kind of at the cusp, pun intended, of a lot of new studies that are going to be done examining growth and physiology and paleobiology of some of these Antarctic animals. Now I'm going to quickly move up section a little bit and get us into the middle Triassic. So we have fossils from the upper Freemouth Formation from a region named Gordon Valley that's closer to the Beardmore Glacier. So There's only a couple of sites that these are known from, so we're moving now to, this is the last time expedition took place in the Beardmore. This was in 2010. This is an overview of that camp. That site was actually discovered in 1985 by Bill Hammer and colleagues, and it's been revisited multiple times when there have been deep field camps in the Beardmore Glacier region. And like my little stratigraphic section is showing you there, historically, this assemblage has been allied with the Sinognathus assemblage zone of the Karoo Basin of South Africa. Right? A lot of similar taxa found there. Here's kind of an overview of what those sediments look like. So the Gordon Valley is kind of in the mid-ground there. We've got a nice big bedding plain, lots of exposure to actually hunt around for fossils. Here's another view from one of the helicopter landing zones, so you're kind of looking out from the mouth of the valley. And if we kind of want to summarize what's going on here, yes, we have specimens like Sinognathus that are known from the Gordon Valley locality, but also some things that seem to be unique, including these large temnospondyl amphibians that Chris has worked on, like Antarctosuchus or Cryostega, that basically appear to be only known in Antarctica, even though they do have some close relatives in other parts of Gondwana. And again, just like everything else, we're continuing to find new specimens from these areas. We're also going back and trying to revise a lot of our existing records and basically place some of this stuff in a more rigorous evolutionary framework. We're starting to question some of the previous taxonomic assignments. We're adding new records of some taxa. There are new canine-myeriform Dicynodonts. So this was one that we just described in Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology last year. What you're looking at is kind of an occipital plate or kind of back of the brain case there. This is a close relative of Canimyeria from South Africa. I'll turn it around just to kind of give you a view. That's the section of the skull that we're actually dealing with. And again, since I'm in the office, I'll hold up the actual specimen here. All right, starting to get a little bigger than the stuff that we have in the early Triassic. And so here is the foramen magnum. Here's the occipital condyle of that specimen right on the back of the skull there. Okay, now we're going to keep marching forward in time. We have rocks from the late Triassic, but no really definitive vertebrate specimens from this region, the central Transantarctics. So we've got kind of a gap in the record, and then we get into the early Jurassic, represented by the Hansen Formation, where we get our first dinosaurs. And it's important to keep in mind, this is still a relatively new discovery, in the sense that these dinosaurs were only first discovered in 1990. David Elliott actually came across what you're looking at right here, which is a femur of Cryolovosaurus weathering out the rock cliff face right there. If you've got a keen eye, you can kind of look underneath that and still see some more of gray bone against that tan buff matrix background. That's other parts of the skull of Cryolovosaurus. And it's also important to realize that the material that I'm talking to you about in terms of the dinosaurs all comes from one site on the side of Mount Kirkpatrick, one of the higher peaks in the central Transantarctic mountains. Right, so we've just got one site that's yielding these fossils so far. And in addition to Cryolovosaurus, we also have remains of a sauropodomorph dinosaur, Glacialosaurus hammeri, and some more fragmentary remains belonging to non-dinosaurian taxa, like the upper arm bone or humerus of a pterosaur, and a tooth from a tritolodont mammal-like reptile. And so here's another overview of the skull of Cryolovosaurus, and this is a nice cast of that material, so you can see we're getting bigger yet as we move up through time. You're missing kind of the snouty parts of this animal because they were weathering out of the cliff face. That earlier photo that I showed you, that was a skull of Cryolovosaurus coming out from the front of the cliff. And one of the cool things that's come out of our study of these Antarctic dinosaurs is that they help contribute to these new ideas about early dinosaur relationships. So a lot of our previous hypotheses about the evolutionary relationships of both carnivorous dinosaurs, but also the long-necked dinosaurs, kind of tended to lump together a lot of the Triassic and Jurassic forms into groups like Coelophysoidea, if we're talking about the carnivorous dinosaurs, or Prosauropoda, if we're talking about the long-necked dinosaurs. And our studies of animals like Cryolovosaurus, but also Glacialosaurus, have kind of split some of those groups apart. And you don't need to be worried about the nitty-gritty of that, but this is kind of a cartoon of what these new relationships or hypotheses kind of look like. And the take home is that it creates more of a ladderized arrangement of evolutionary relationships at the base of these major dinosaur groups. And you may think, well, that's not a big deal. All you're really doing is maybe moving a few branches around on the evolutionary tree of life. But it does have some implications for major patterns of evolution in these early dinosaur groups in terms of the evolution of large body size or changes in ecology. Since a lot of these taxa actually belong or are from the late Triassic and the early Jurassic, where we put them in the evolutionary tree sometimes has implications for survivorship across that end Triassic mass extinction boundary and other patterns of diversity through time. So that's one of the reasons why we're really interested in fleshing out this pattern of relationships at the base of these dinosaur groups. And of course, work on the early Jurassic dinosaurs continues, and we've brought a lot of great material back from that last expedition. We now know that we actually have multiple specimens of Cryolophosaurus, some new material of Glacialosaurus. Right, so here's an overview of some of the skeletal elements of Cryolophosaurus that we know of right now. And the one thing that we're really excited about is some new sauropodomorph material, including what we believe to be new species. Here's prepared blocks put back together where you can see some of the hind limbs there in pink, some of the shoulder girdle elements, and in green are going to be the forelimbs. Here's another block partially prepared that you're looking at where in pink I'm showing you some of the vertebral column. Here in blue are the ribs. Green are the hind limbs, right? And so what we have here is a new species of one of these early long-necked or sauropodomorph dinosaurs. What was most exciting about this find, and we didn't know it at the time in the field, is that one of these blocks that we excavated, that's about this size, ended up having this really, really gorgeous skull in it. And you can see by the scale bar there that this isn't that large of a skull or that large of an animal altogether, and that's probably because it's only a few years old, maybe 4 or 5 years old. So if we start stitching these together, what are we kind of seeing, larger scale biogeographic patterns are we seeing in Antarctica? Well, we do kind of have a very coarse pattern of increasing endemism over time, right? If we go back to the early Triassic fauna, we have a lot of things that link up with other parts of Gondwana. We have some of the same species that we find in the South African Karoo Basin, potentially some oddballs. We start to get more unique taxa in the form of some of these large temnospondyle amphibians in the middle Triassic. By the time we get to the early Jurassic, pretty much everything that we're finding there at that Hansen Formation site are unique taxa that are only known in Antarctica, although they do have close relatives in other parts of Gondwana in the world. But this is still just kind of scratching the surface of the story that Antarctica and the central Transantarctic Mountains have to tell us. Right? I kind of tried to emphasize that even as we move up through geologic time in the record in the Transantarctic Mountains, we're dealing with a smaller and smaller number of sites. Right? So one of the things we want to do is expand this early Mesozoic vertebrate fossil record well beyond the Shackleton and Beardmore Glacier regions, right? So that we're not just kind of extrapolating what we know about Antarctic dinosaurs from one site on the side of Mount Kirkpatrick. A lot of this is going to involve kind of interdisciplinary and collaborative work to refine stratigraphic correlations and the timescales for sites from the Permian through the Jurassic. But then also kind of understanding and placing a lot of these vertebrate fossils in a more refined evolutionary framework, right? So that means a lot of revisionary taxonomic work, a lot of work kind of revising phylogenetic and evolutionary relationships so that we can then do those more nuanced studies of biogeography, of community assembly, that can tell us more about these animals and the world that they lived in. And one of the most fun parts about doing all that kind of synergistic or synthetic work is that we then get to share it with everybody else in things like the Antarctic Dinosaurs exhibit, which is now on display at the Natural History Museum of Utah. This was led by the Field Museum in Chicago, and Pete Makovicky and I co-curated this exhibit. Lots of amazing stuff. You'll get to actually walk through the different assemblages that we talked about today, so learn a little bit more about the early Triassic, the middle Triassic, and the early Jurassic vertebrate faunas, as well as what's going on in Antarctica at the end of the age of dinosaurs. And we also use this exhibit as a way to talk a little bit more about what's happening in Antarctica today and the different kinds of research that goes on there. The highlights, of course, are the dinosaurs, right? Including some fleshed out reconstructions with these beautiful murals, making the exhibit as a whole really, really immersive. And those are kind of the key things that I take away from this exhibit, is that we're bringing you a lot of really authentic stuff, the real specimens, the real gear. It's a real immersive narrative story. We're trying to make this available to everybody. And also, there's a lot of big picture crammed in here too. So the dinosaurs, as usual, are the hook to get you in. That's why we have things like DinoFest. But we can use dinosaurs as kind of a medium or a gateway to talk about bigger picture things in terms of Earth-life transitions through time, how Antarctica functions as a really interdisciplinary and collaborative international science hub, and also not just Antarctica's past, but how that past can inform us about what's happening in Antarctica today and where Antarctica's future may lie. And coming right on the heels of this exhibit, and hopefully to a safely reopened theater near you, will be Dinosaurs of Antarctica, a large format film that's put together by Giant Screen Films that explores a lot of these same topics and talks about some of the different expeditions that have taken place in the central Transantarctic Mountains. So with that, I'd like to thank you again for streaming in today, and thank my colleagues and friends at the Natural History Museum of Utah for inviting me to participate in DinoFest 2021. I wish I could be there with all of you in person, but here's to a brighter new year, and I hope to see you all soon. Take care.